wash all the soil away from the roots, and they'll fan the roots out and put them in the ground and then cover them up. That's a little extreme for me, and I don't think it's really necessary, but this business of cutting the circling, girdling roots is really important. Any questions about that?
Are you going to tell us when's the best time to plant trees?
Sure.
Like fruit trees?
Best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. Second best time to plant a tree is today. You know, you plant plants when you find nice plants. You can plant, since we're not doing major damage to the root system of plants, we plant plants 365 days a year. There's not a good time or a bad time. There's a better time. And if you had to pick the best time to plant your woody trees and shrubs, it's in the fall. Why is that? Because in our climate, as anybody will agree today, the summer season is harder on plants and people than the winter season is. And if you plant in the fall, the tree has the longest, or plant of any sort, has the longest period of time to get adjusted, to get its roots down and spread out before summer weather hits. But you can plant 365 days a year. There's never a bad time to plant. Now things like fruit trees, because most of the fruit trees come out of California, they're all shipped the first or second week of January. You'll find your very best selection of fruit trees in early spring. But if I were going to plant a peach tree today, and I could find a nice peach tree, I'd plant it. Nothing at all wrong with planting now, as long as you can water. Okay, so now we have put the tree, the shrub, whatever else. We put the plant in the ground. We split the sides of the root ball. And by the way, if the plant seems really dry when you take it out of the container, before you put it in the ground, stick it in a bucket of water and let it soak for a few minutes. Because if it's really dry when it goes in the ground, it's very hard to re-wet that root ball properly. So stick it in a bucket of water, let it soak long enough to water properly, to moisten it properly, and then put it in the ground. You can backfill around the plant, but don't get carried away with putting the best soil you can possibly find back in the hole. Because once again, what's going to happen is you're going to encourage that plant to keep all its roots in the good soil. It's not going to want to grow out into that lousy soil that surrounds it. I like to work a little bit of compost in. I like to take the soil that I've taken out of the hole, maybe put, at most a fourth or a third compost mixed with that soil, and then fill that back in around. But to me, the most important thing you do after you plant is to mulch the plants. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about mulches, but in general, plant the plant, fill in with the soil, water thoroughly, and put a layer of mulch on the surface. Rarely will you ever need to stake something up. If you stake a tree in place, you say, well, I don't want it to blow over. Well, it's kind of like splitting, a broken limb. Inside gets really weak. When you take that cast off, the bone may have healed, but you've got a really weak structure there. And if you firmly anchor a plant in place, either by tying it up or by putting a stake in and tying it tightly, you're really depriving that plant of a chance to develop a really strong root. And when you take that stake away, big windstorm comes along, that plant snaps off and it's on the ground. Not the tree's fault, it's your fault for staking it, like that. If you are in such a windy area that you feel like the thing's just going to blow out of the ground, well, you can stake it or you can guy it up, but do not stake it tightly. Give it room to move back and forth, because that's what builds a really strong plant. Now, just one other thing I want to tell you about trees in particular, another big mistake that a lot of people make when they plant trees, is they go back and they cut all the limbs up and down the trunk of the tree. I had a discussion with one of my neighbors up in the hill country, called me and said that he had gotten into a very animated discussion with a guy that claimed he had once worked for an arborist. I don't know who the arborist was, so I could never ever recommend him. But he claimed that the limbs on a tree move up as the tree grows. That limb that's 2 feet off the ground now is going to be way up above your head a few years from now. Wrong. If that limb is 2 feet off the ground now, it's always going to be 2 feet off the ground. So should you cut it off? No, you shouldn't cut it off. Because everywhere that you've got leaves, you've got that sugar being manufactured is being pumped back into the tree, and that trunk is growing faster in diameter because of this constant infusion of nutrients coming in from those little limbs up and down the trunk. So we've got a quandary here. We don't want a major limb 2 feet off the ground, but we want the leaves. So what do? Young trees go through I do it in the winter because the leaves are off the tree and I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. But I'll go all the way up and down the trunk, and all those limbs, I will cut them back to where they're maybe somewhere 6 to 12 inches long. If you looked at the new elms that are planted in front of my barn, it just looks like a green furry trunk all the way up and down. The trunk's about this big around. There's just a mass of little limbs and leaves. That trunk will grow in diameter so much more quickly than if you cut those limbs off. If you cut all those limbs off, 2 years from now, the trunk that was that big would probably be that big. You leave all those little limbs on it, the trunk that was that size will be this size. Makes a big, big difference. Our technical term for it is trashy trunk. And then when the tree trunk gets up to about 6 inches or so in diameter, then you can go through and cut those limbs all the way off. But as a young tree, leaving those little limbs up and down the trunk is very important. But don't let them make major scaffold limbs. Don't let them make great big limbs that are, then going to be in the way and cause problems, and you have to go cut the whole thing off later. Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
When we're digging the dirt out of the hole and it has rocks in there, is it best to put the rocks back in when you refill, or try to take them out?
I usually take them out. In the days years ago when I was doing landscape work, I considered the ideal job was to have customer A paying me to take the rocks out of the ground. Customer B needed rocks edging around the flower bed, and so I'd take the rocks over there. No, I'm teasing to some extent, but no. Rocks really, they're just taking up room that could well be, have good root system in it. So take it out if it's really lousy soil. If it's pure caliche, take it out and replace it. But in general, our native soil, I like rocky soil, because if you have rocky soil, you usually have good soil around those rocks. If you have caliche without the rocks, you got lousy soil to begin with all over the place. But up in the hill country, you get the rocks out of the ground, you got some pretty decent soil to deal with. If you're, I'll answer your question in a second. If you're looking at an area and you're wondering how hard it's going to be to dig in the area, look at the native trees in the area. I can drive through a neighborhood and I can tell you how much soil you have in that neighborhood. If you look out and there are 50 oak trees out there and they're all about this big around, man, I wouldn't anymore want to dig a hole there, because you're going to get down 3 inches at most and you're going to hit a solid shelf of rock. But you go out and maybe you got some big rocks exposed up on the surface of the ground, but you got those oak trees that are like this scattered here and there, no problem. Because there your rocks have nice fissures down between them. Those roots can go deep, and that's why you've got a big tree. And you may pry some rocks out of the ground, doing your planting, but you're going to have good soil underneath it. So that's how I judge lots of time. Question? Yes,
yeah, just on that girdling issue, one last thing about the soil. I've planted plumbagos around the live oak I have in my yard, and I can't see it anymore. Is there any danger of I didn't build up any soil there, but the sun, nothing gets to it. The plumbagos are real thick around
this winter when they freeze back partially, or when you prune them, get down and look at the base of the tree. You should, if it looks like a fence post in the ground or a telephone pole, it's buried. You got to get that dirt away. You should see the root flare. I've got places on some parts of my ranch where I've got very shallow rock that the tree trunk is this big around and the root flare is this big around, especially on Lacey's oaks and others. You got to see that root flare to have a healthy tree.
How close, I hear different things about the mulch. How close do you put it to the tree trunk?
Well, let's think about what we were just talking about. We want air circulation around the tree so that it's not staying constantly moist. So if you've got room enough for air circulation, no problem. I say the mulch can, be within 2 or 3 inches of the tree.
Can you that?
Oh yeah.
Okay, but not right up to it.
Well, the only thing, you don't want wet stuff piled around that trunk. If you don't have wet stuff piled around that trunk, you are just fine.
You're seeing that
There are, pick me an industry and I'll show you some idiots in that industry. Show me the landscape industry and I'll show you a lot of idiots in that. I mean, in this business, all you have to be a landscaper is a pickup truck, a magnetic sign, and a shovel. And whoop-de-doo, you're suddenly an expert. And I just shudder the things that I hear and see, and unfortunately the internet these days has made experts out of a lot of people that don't know what the hell they're doing, and they don't know. They're looking at a website from northern New York State and they're trying to apply what they learned to this area. If you're ever looking at somebody to do the work, man, ask for references, ask to look at a job. It's my standard thing. Somebody comes in and says, I've got John Doe Landscape Company.